Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Indyk, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and delighted to be here back at INSS's annual conference, which goes from strength to strength every year under the leadership of Sir Frank Lowy and Amos Yadlin and the great team that they have assembled here. We meet on a momentous occasion, and we have, as Amos said, a very distinguished panel to discuss both the Trump peace plan that has just in these moments been unveiled to the world, and as well as that, the other critically important issue of what to do about Iran. Let me quickly introduce the panelists so we can get on with the discussion of these two critical issues. Barbara Leaf, to my left, is the director of the Goddard Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a think tank that I know something about. A distinguished Foreign Service officer. She served as US Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, and before that as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula and also for Iraq. She is a preeminent expert in Washington on the Gulf states and Iran. General Votel is a retired US Army 4-star officer, most recently the commander of US Central Command that's responsible for US military operations in the Middle East, the Levant, and Central and South Asia. As he can attest, that actually doesn't include Israel. During his 39 years in the military, he commanded special operations and conventional military forces at every level. Most notably, he led the 79-member coalition that successfully liberated Iraq and Syria from the Islamic State Caliphate. John Allen currently serves as the president of the Brookings Institution. He too is a 4-star general, retired US Marine Corps general, former commander of the NATO ISAF force in Afghanistan, commander of all forces in Afghanistan, and has also served as special presidential envoy to the global coalition to counter ISIL, counterpart to General Votel in the leading the campaign against ISIS. General Allen has also, as many of you will know, played a critical part in developing security arrangements for an Israeli-Palestinian settlement known as the Allen Plan. He worked under Secretary of State John Kerry, and I had the honor to be his partner in that effort as the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And then there's Richard Haass, my boss, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Before taking on that role and leading the organization into its centennial, he served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland, which provided the foundation for the Northern Ireland Peace Accord. And he also served before that as Director of Policy Planning under Secretary of State Colin Powell in the Bush 43 administration, and before that in George W. Bush's father's administration. He was George H.W. Bush's Middle East advisor in the White House, played a particularly important role in the first Iraq war. And of course there's Amos Yadlin. Do I need to tell everybody who you are? Okay. Let me take a moment, since you were here and didn't have the opportunity to watch the President's speech, to first of all describe the environment. There was an adoring crowd of people who engaged in prolonged standing ovations. Standing next to the president was the Prime Minister of Israel. And in the audience, it was a little hard to tell exactly who was there, except when the president gave some shout-outs, was, of course, the president's peace team of Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and Avi Berkowitz, but also the ambassadors of the UAE, Oman, and Bahrain. Not Egypt, has peace with Israel, not Jordan, not Saudi Arabia, but some of the smaller Arab states were represented by their ambassadors. In terms of the details of the speech, of the plan, there were not a lot of details given, which makes it a little bit difficult to discuss, but since Amos has a good deal of understanding of what's in the details, I'll ask him in a moment to give us what he knows of that. And nothing that was said is inconsistent with what you and I know, Amos. I think what is most important about what was presented with Netanyahu standing by the side of the president was he said that this plan distinguished itself from others that were light on factual details, John.
Say that again.
This plan is different from previous plans because the previous plans were light on factual details, but this one is 80 pages long, the most detailed proposal ever presented. And it comprises nuanced and fact-based remedies to establish a win-win peace based on a realistic two-state solution, which reconciles Palestinian statehood with Israeli security. And with Netanyahu standing by his side, he said that Netanyahu was willing to endorse the vision, his vision, Trump's vision, as a basis for negotiations. And he then praised Netanyahu for accepting this proposal for a two-state solution. There was a reference to how recognition of sovereignty can be immediately achieved. That's what the president said. That's what I heard him say. But it was rather ambiguous as to what he was referring to. Netanyahu took away that ambiguity in his remarks and said that the president had recognized now Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley, over all of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and Israeli sovereignty over an undivided Jerusalem. It's not clear to me that that's exactly what the plan does, or whether the recognition of sovereignty comes after the plan is agreed on by both sides. Neither the Prime Minister nor the President clarified that, but there's a straight-out statement by Netanyahu that Israeli sovereignty has been recognized by President Trump over the Jordan Valley and all of the settlements. He then went on to say that there was a lot in this for the Palestinians. They would have an independent state of their own, that this could be their last opportunity to get this, that Palestinian territory would be more than doubled, and they would have a capital in East Jerusalem, and the United States would open an embassy there. I'll leave it to Amos to explain exactly what a capital in East Jerusalem for Palestinians that's envisaged under this proposal. So that is the essence of it. I don't want to spend a lot more time going through it, all the hortatory language. As I say, there was not a lot more detail on that, but there was, and perhaps we can start here. There was an emphasis that Israel's security requirements would be met in full. So Amos, perhaps you can give us a little more detail, first of all starting with the security and then with the territory envisaged by the Trump peace plan.
Since I was in this room, I don't want to get into the between the line, but it's very similar to what I published yesterday, which basically saying it's a dream plan for the Israelis. It's all the parameters that we wanted and maybe a little bit more than we wanted. About security, basically everything. Everything, the Jordan Valley, Israel controlling all the border crossing, air and electromagnetic sphere by Israel, and freedom of action to destroy terror if the Palestinians are not doing it. So this is on security, Israel got everything. On borders, depends from which angle you look at it. The president wants the Palestinians to think that what they have now is 40% of the West Bank and they will have 80. But the Palestinians see it as they want 100, maybe 200, but they are getting only 80. So once again, from Israeli point of view, the Jordan Valley and the settlement bloc are in a consensus in Israel. He gave us too much with the isolated settlements, but if this is a base for negotiation, it's not that bad. On Jerusalem, once again, depends how you look at it. The Israelis got basically Jerusalem that they have today, and recognition in this city as the Israeli capital. For the Palestinians, he gave a capital in Jerusalem, but it's not really Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem suburbs, Abu Dis or something like this. I don't know whether he stated the exact neighborhood. I think what's really important are 2 points. First, that it's two-state solution, and the prime minister basically may destroy his bloc, his political bloc, because there is about part of his bloc, 10%, and 10% in the Israeli Knesset is very important, that are not willing to give the Palestinian even 1% of the West Bank, and not a land, not a state. So this is very important in my opinion. Second, this plan is not gonna be the peace. It's not gonna even be a basis for peace negotiation, because the Palestinians rejected it a year and a half away before, and they don't intend to negotiate on that. What is important to look at is the day after the plan was published. 3 possibilities. One, like other plans, the Reagan plan, the Rogers plan, the Kerry plan, Barak plan, Olmert plan, it will be on the shelf, not to say in the garbage of history. This is one possibility and nothing will be changed. Second, dangerous. An Israeli decision, or let's say prime minister decision, the attorney general is not yet here, he may say whether it's legal or not, may decide to annex what the president have given him tonight. This is for me something that has a lot of risks, and I think this is the most important issue to understand, whether Trump gave him a blank check to do it. My feeling, he didn't, but I may be wrong. And the third option is the options that Israel should adopt after the election. Taking these parameters, trying to negotiate with the Palestinians, with another government, and if the Palestinians continue to refuse to negotiate, implement element of it bottom up in a way that will keep the two-state solution alive, and don't let the Palestinian have a veto on how we want to see Israel in the future.
Thank you. John, Alan, it's very difficult to ask you to compare the security arrangements here with the security arrangements in your plan, since you don't know exactly what the security arrangements are. So I'll ask you a more general question. Listening to what I and Amos have said, what's your reaction to it as somebody who was heavily involved in negotiating between the Palestinians and Israelis?
Several things. I think if the Prime Minister has concluded that the President just ceded someone else's territory in the outcome, without the Palestinians being at the table or even potentially having expressed themselves on this issue, this is going to go over very badly in the United States. It just is. A lot of work has gone on over the years to try to create an environment where Americans set the conditions where Israelis and Palestinians will come together and have a thorough negotiation, a constructive negotiation on the best interests of both sides. One, to have a secure Israel, the other to have a sovereign Palestine, and to live in harmony with each other. And if the outcome of that is no Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, that the Jordan River Valley is now not just, as we had all agreed before, would have a long-term Israeli presence, but is now annexed. If in fact the settlements are not resolved and they ultimately become permanent Israeli territory on the West Bank, this is very different than I think the vast majority of the Americans who've been watching this process unfold would have expected. So I think that's going to be an issue. There was a lot of work that was done in previous administrations, and I smiled, of course, when the President said that all of previous administrations' work was light. You know, the Oslo Accord was not light. The work that was done in other administrations was not light. The level of detail that we went through under the Kerry efforts to try to find every possible way to secure Israel's security over the long term with agreed security measures in the various domains in which Israel and a Palestinian state would have to exist. All of that was very, very detailed. And it still's on the shelf, as Amos properly said, and is there ultimately to inform the process going forward. But I'm not a diplomat. I admire diplomats, but I think most diplomats would say that there has to be two people at the table in order for you to have negotiations. I don't know who we're going to find to put at the table on the other side of our dear friends from Israel when the time comes to begin to sort this out. I just don't.
Thank you. Richard, given that you have had experience with that other long-standing conflict in Ireland, and given your own knowledge about and involvement in these Arab-Israeli negotiations, and the fact that you, like me, had the opportunity to watch the show while everybody else here was otherwise engaged, what's your reaction to this as a diplomat?
A couple of things, in no particular order. One is I think the administration did itself no favor by how it launched this. There's a lot of substance in this plan, and I haven't, until I read all the dozens of pages, I don't feel that comfortable talking about it, but there's substance in it, and there's things for both sides, not equally balanced, but there's things in it for both sides. But to launch it in front of what we would call a partisan crowd at the White House with the Prime Minister of Israel standing next to the President did the plan no favor. It immediately gave it the sense of one-sidedness and added a political overlay, which I would argue was, in some ways, worked against the interests of those who want this to succeed. So I would say one thing. Second of all, plans are just that. Plans are, in this case, what, 40, 50 pages. What matters, in my experience, and I think several of you up here who have worked on these things as well might agree, is the follow-up to the plan. We've called it the Middle East peace process for years because plans are never self-actualizing. They don't just happen. They are rather the beginning of interaction, both within each side and then between the various sides. And there was no mention whatsoever, unless I missed it, of what happens next. So there is zero chance. It's always dangerous to speak in absolutes, but I'm comfortable in this one. There is zero chance that the Palestinians will accept this plan as it is. Indeed, I'm not sure what the odds are that they do not rejected out of hand. I'll come back to that in a second. But to me, one of the big questions is what happens tomorrow? And then what happens the day after tomorrow? What is the process? Is it all or nothing? This was an American plan. The United States doesn't have essentially relations with the Palestinians right now. What happens there? Is this something for Israelis and Palestinians or Americans involved? What choices do we want Palestinians to make if they don't like the framing of the East Jerusalem issue, if they don't like the territorial distribution, what have you? What recourse do they have? So to me, one of the big mysteries, probably one of the two biggest mysteries, is what happens next. The other big mystery is what Martin was alluding to, was this, the different way this issue of unilateralism and annexation on the Israeli side. At one point, what seemed to be suggested was nothing would happen for 4 years. At other points, it was suggested that maybe things could happen sooner. It also was not clear what the United States' position was on unilateral acts such as annexation. And that's why, again, what to me matters at least as much, if not more, is what's on the paper, is what is to come next in terms of a process. Why don't I leave it at that? Because
Thank you.
we've already said a lot about something we haven't read.
I should add that the President did say that he'd written a letter to President Abbas. He said that he'd heard from lots of people. He got a call from Boris, he said, expressing support. But there were 3 ambassadors from the Gulf, Barbara, in the audience. And I just wonder what you think is likely to be the Arab reaction. Bearing in mind that I think Jared Kushner had this idea that he would engage the Arab states, given their common interests with Israel against Iran, to help in the process of bringing the Palestinians to the table. And yet, it wasn't a great turnout since all the Arab foreign ministers were invited and only 3 ambassadors turned up. But what do you think the reaction will be, particularly in the Gulf with Saudi Arabia, the UAE?
Well, I think I think it's quite telling. It's as telling who isn't there as who is. I understand Jordan declined, and I've heard Egypt asked not to be invited. Presumably they were anyway, but in any case, they're not there. Saudi Arabia is obviously the big empty chair. So, yes, I think from the administration's perspective, well, at least they got the UAE, Bahrain, and Oman, but where does that take things? I'm not sure it takes things anywhere. None of those, not one of those states will want to be seen as pressuring the Palestinians to accept something, especially if Abu Mazen comes straight out of the box and declines it in toto. And while Oman, under Sultan Qaboos, good offices had stepped in to offer his help with the Palestinians and Israelis, I don't think his successor is in any position to undertake such a task. But the bottom line is nobody will want to be seen as press-ganging the Palestinians, nor are they in a position to coax them with inducements. It's striking to me that money is constantly tossed out there as the ultimate inducement to get the Palestinians to the table to agree to it. And I frankly can't imagine anything that's more enraging or sort of a greater blow to dignity and self-respect than to be on the receiving end of these kinds of messages. So it's, to my mind, it's going to fall flat. I think there was an indication a couple of days ago where the Saudis were in terms of the sensitivity of everything about the Israeli-Palestinian issue when there was this report in the Israeli press that Israel would begin issuing or authorizing Israelis to travel to the kingdom on Israeli passports, a practice that I mean, as people know, Israeli Arabs have been traveling for years with both sides' knowledge of that. And immediately, a Saudi official denied that the kingdom would allow Israelis to come to the kingdom. So I think there's great sensitivity there. I think the King Salman has the ultimate say on all these matters, and he's been very clear that his point of reference is 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative. And I think it will simply fall like a stone elsewhere around the region.
So just to follow up on this one point, as I understand it, President Trump would like the Arabs to support this proposal as a basis for negotiations. In other words, not to accept the whole thing, but as a basis for negotiations.
Yeah, I think that's another area that I would put in unclear.
Unclear.
Whether it's an all or whether this is kind of a menu fixed prix or whether this is a la carte. That to me is one of the other areas that is to be clarified. The money issues even to be clarified. Whether the language the president used tonight was that the money would go to a Palestinian state, i.e. would the money only begin to flow if the Palestinians had signed on, as opposed to something on the way. So again, I just...
And
yeah.
what's the provenance of the money? I mean, I
Yeah.
think there certainly our Gulf partners don't like to be treated as walking checkbooks. But, you know, this term, the Arabs, is thrown around so loosely. And when the administration uses it in this context, I understand it to mean Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi Arabia did not show up today.
We just had one other point that I think will end up being critically important, particularly to Saudi Arabia, is that President Trump made absolutely clear that the United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital and stressed that, and made it clear that the United States has recognized Israeli sovereignty on all of the Jerusalem that Israel now controls, except for the parts of Jerusalem that are beyond the barrier or wall. At least that's my understanding of it. And he did say that the status quo would be preserved in the religious holy sites. But the idea that Israel will have sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is something that I do not believe Saudi Arabia could possibly accept. So there's a kind of sleight of hand in his presentation that you know, the Palestinians will have their capital in East Jerusalem, but it kind of misses the fact that the thing that, as I understand it, you correct me if I'm wrong, Barbara, the Saudis care about is who has sovereignty
Exactly.
over the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Exactly.
Okay, so Amos, unless you want to add something, we'll move to Iran.
Yes, it's about time.
Okay. And
What does this announcement, how does this affect the current elections? Could we have
right,
something on that?
okay.
Before I do that,
Yes.
if Netanyahu wants to make an announcement to assume annexation, the parliament, he doesn't have the parliament. So what does his announcement mean?
In case you couldn't hear Sir Frank's question, was how is this all going to impact on the Israeli elections, and in particular, what is the likelihood that we'll have annexation before the elections, annexation of the Jordan Valley as Netanyahu has promised? Amos, do you want to respond to that?
I'm not expert on judicial issues. We have a bigger expert just enter the room, and I hope he will answer it. To the best of my knowledge, it is not in the tradition of Israel that a transition government will do something substantial. But we also saw in Israel that many things that are not in our traditional behavior was violated in the last year. On the election itself, I already said, I don't think that any voter of Kahol Lavan will move to Likud because of annexation. He may take some voters from the other side, but I think in his move that is a brave move. In a way, he broke his bloc. But it's too early to see, to say, let's wait a week. A week is a long time in Israel, and still before the election. So I promise you an answer next Tuesday.
So let me just pursue this for one moment. Netanyahu broke his bloc, you say. And Netanyahu is an experienced politician. So he breaks his bloc in favor of what?
That's a very good question. And I think he wanted very much to divert the attention from what was planned for today, a discussion in the Knesset about his immunity. You know, the chief of defense intelligence saw some immunities that were broken in the Middle East. This is another immunity that was broken today. And maybe he did a miscalculation, even though he is a great politician.
It's always dangerous to have an American opine about Israeli politics. I would just say that in the last 48 hours, Martin and I have had more meetings than I can count with Israeli politicians. And the other competing theory that came up quite regularly was that the prime minister understood that this would break his bloc, that he would lose support, but also calculated that in the third election, no one could get sufficient seats, and this is a prelude to a national unity government. I'm not saying that is an attempt to create one, and I'm not saying that is I'm just saying that is analysis that we heard in more meetings than I would have thought before I came here a few days ago.
General Votel, you've been very patient. Thank you. I apologize
Thank you for not
that.
inviting me to comment.
Exactly,
on
I was going to say that. I bet you were happy that you didn't have to comment. But you do have to comment on Iran, because you've had a lot of experience in dealing with Iran. And we now have a situation in which, on the one hand, the leader of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and a senior official at that, Soleimani, General Soleimani is no longer with us. And on the other hand, Iran is advancing its enrichment of uranium. And that is marching ahead without any restriction, while Iran's economy is being choked. So from a military point of view, at this point, given what's happening there, how do you see the Iranian challenge, and how should we effectively address it?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. So, first off, I mean, as it's been said many times by many others here, there are no tears shed for Qasem Soleimani. He got everything he deserved, in terms of what our action against them. I do look at this as a period of some opportunity. This strike, in conjunction with kind of other unfortunate activities that occurred on this, and the shoot down of the Ukrainian airliner, I think have created a lot of pressure on the Iranians. And I think this is an opportunity for us to kind of double down. From a military standpoint, I think our job is to continue to be strong, continue to contain, continue to limit Iran's ability to respond in other ways around the region, and support the sanctions regime and the pressure campaign. I think this decision to strike Qasem Soleimani, you can decide whether you think it was a good one or a bad one, but it's a fact at this particular point. It's important that I think we follow through right now and use it to the best advantage we can to move them forward.
Thank you. In terms of U.S. force deployment in the Gulf, we now have, I believe, a carrier task force there. But we didn't have one there for quite some time because it had been shifted, as far as I understand it, to Asia. And as far as I understand it, please comment on this, Pentagon's priority is to deploy forces in Asia, not in the Gulf anymore. As former commander of Central Command, is there a tension there between where the Pentagon wants to place its priorities and the need to have a force there to deal with Iran?
Sure. Well, there certainly is, and I would just say, you know, I'm on the record as being supportive of the President's National Defense Strategy, or the Secretary's National Defense Strategy, that put a focus on maintaining competitive advantage against great power competitors, Russia and in particular China. And this means we have to compete in the Asian Pacific, and whether that is through military presence and activities or through our economic or other diplomatic or informational activities we have, there's a combination of things we do. But it was very clear to me as the CENTCOM commander where the priority lies. That said, we have interests in the Middle East. And we have to compete for these interests, and the Middle East is an area of great power competition as well. So we've got to stay engaged there. Now, with respect to the current force posture, the United States has great capability. We can move a carrier, and we can move additional resources into the area, and we can sustain them for a period of time. But there will become a tension point here, where sustaining large amounts of forces in this theater will come at the cost of other things that our strategy calls for. And this will require that we make some decisions. Right now, it appears we have made decisions to, you know, kind of double down, make sure we're well protected here. We can deal with the situation that's emerging. But in the long term, we'll have to look at how that is sustained. The issue here, from a force standpoint, in my belief, is sustaining capability. That's always been the issue, particularly for these long engagements. And so this will be an important challenge that we will have to deal with as this plays out.
John, do you have any comment on that in terms of how the United States should deal with this tension between the need to address the threat from China versus the need to protect our interests in the Gulf?
Well, Joe said it very well. General Whittel said it very well, and I didn't get the chance. I was hyperventilating at the early description of the peace plan, so I didn't get the chance to recognize Sir Frank and the wonderful work that he's done here at INSS, and almost the wonderful partnership that is growing now between this organization and Brookings, and I really look forward to the future. And I'd have to acknowledge a very dear friend that's sitting in the audience in the front row, H.R. McMaster, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army, who was our previous National Security Advisor. So almost anything that I say probably won't make any sense to him because he thought of it first. Under the last administration, I'm just looking at my notes here, not whether I'm able to read the peace plan. Under the last administration, the president made the decision to conduct, euphemistically, the pivot to Asia. And I think that we have had, as a nation with global interest, which is what we have, we've had to acknowledge that there are real limitations on the amount of force that we have at our fingertips at any given day. So we have to maintain the capacity to support our European friends in the context of deterrence in Europe. We have to maintain the capacity to support our interest in the Middle East, and those are still quite deep and quite tangible and quite important to the United States and to the region, and certainly to our ally here, which is Israel. But then at the same time, we have deep, deep interests in the Indo-Pacific region, which we've now renamed from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, because the region over which the United States ultimately believes it will have to compete with China will include the Indian Ocean region and South Asia. And against all those three really disparate contingency requirements and deterrence requirements, we've got to spread the U.S. military force. And so at any given time, I'm sure that the Secretary and the Chairman will be working closely with the President to make the kinds of force allocations necessary to both support our friends in East Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region, to deter China in the Middle East, to support our friends in the Gulf, to ensure, as we have traditionally sought to create as much stability as we can in the region, and to ensure that the energy supplies do not fall under the influence of a malevolent force. And then ultimately in Europe, to provide the kind of coherence to NATO so it has the credibility that it needs to as a deterrent force against Russia. That's a tall order, and that's a lot of force. And at any given time, some of that force is being modernized, some of that force is in for refit, some of that force is training. And when you think about all of that, it should not come as a surprise that sometimes, in order for us to project the kinds of great power presence that we need to in the Indo-Pacific region, that we're going to have to short the forces in the Middle East. It's also useful to understand that, and I think Joe would recognize this as the CENTCOM commander because we dealt with it frequently. If there's a carrier strike group out here, it's because we have a reason for that carrier strike group to be here. It might be to send a message, or it might be to have it in place at the right moment, ultimately to tip the balance very quickly with the application of a lot of force coming off that carrier deck. So, and we would know, those of us who've worked the strategy out there, that the positioning of forces was often as much an issue of sending a message as it was being able to fight at the drop of a hat. And so it's a very complex, if you will, three-dimensional chess game. With the United States, with global interests constantly attempting to support allies and friends, deter and dissuade our opponents, and ultimately, in this case, in East Asia, we cannot back down there now because of the nature of the emergence of the Chinese threat.
Barbara, let me just ask you quickly, because we're going to have to wrap up, and I want to get to Richard and Amos, but in terms of the view from the Gulf, and these Arab states in the Gulf that are right across from Iran, how do they view now U.S. policy and U.S. presence there? We saw them, some of them quickly moving to try to reconcile with Iran when they thought the United States was not prepared to defend their interests. Where do you see them now in this?
Well, Martin, I wouldn't say that they were looking for rapprochement so much as they were looking to just sort of lower tensions, get their heads back down below the trench line, not have a shot taken directly at them. There was, you know, the UAE was very sobered by the May 12th attacks on the tankers off Fujairah. Well, imagine the Saudis' feelings on, you know, on September 14th. That was a strategic strike on the heart of their energy industry. And I think the problem was all summer long, going straight into September, the administration really didn't respond, and in the eyes of the Gulf partners. So there was great trepidation. On the other hand, the shot that finally was taken took off one of the most important figures, one of the most important nightmarish figures for all of them, Qasem Soleimani, and it was a double strike because it also took off the most powerful militia commander and political figure in Iraq. So it was a twofer, but I think they remain extremely, to a high degree, uncertain as to the president's intent and to the president's red lines beyond American citizens or American facilities.
Thank you. Amos, what's your assessment of U.S. policy in terms of dealing with Iran, the threat from Iran?
You know, there was an assessment in the intelligence, defense intelligence, as well as in our institute. And towards the end of December, the bottom line was Iran is with the upper hand. They have self-confidence that they accumulated after attacking tankers with no response, downing an American UAV with no response, then the attack on 50% of Saudi export capabilities. And it seems like the Iranians getting more and more self-confidence, and America is disengaging. The president said that he's leaving Syria. The fact that in the eyes of the Middle Eastern countries, they betrayed the Kurds. And it seems like straightforward, Iran up, America going away. The Soleimani attack changed the perception. And what unfortunate happened in Iran, that 50 people were killed in the funeral, and almost 100 or 80, but the Canadians were also Iranians, and the cover-up. All this changed the perception. I think the Iranians are now much more worried from the forces that the Americans has in the Middle East. They haven't withdrawn all of them. If I don't mistaken, you have an air base in Qatar, you have an air base in Oman, you have the carrier task force, and you are not leaving. I think this message is very, very important. Last but not least, I read in the first 24 hours your media, and it seems like people are mourning Qasem Soleimani. War is gonna come. This was a big mistake. We have killed a very respected leader. He is a terrorist with hands full of blood, 600 Americans during the time you commanded forces in Iraq. 500,000 Syrians, together with the Russians and Assad. Iraqis, Iranians. The Middle East is a better place without Soleimani. No doubt about it. Tactically, strategically, and from justice point of view.
Richard, where does the United States go from here in terms of dealing with Iran? What's your prescription for US policy?
I'll get to the prescription, but give me 1 or 2 minutes to get there, because I've heard several things I just flat out disagree with.
You can have 1 minute, yeah.
I think there's 2 separate questions. Was the strike legal? I would suggest not under US law or under international law. We had no authorization for the use of military force against Iran that would do this. It also did not meet the criteria of imminence, which is essential for anticipatory self-defense. Was it smart? You've already heard the conversation about the opportunity cost, greater emphasis here. I think it reflected a certain lack of strategic discipline. It ceded the initiative to Iran in many ways, because Iran will now decide to what extent the United States is forced not simply to keep forces in the Middle East, but use them. And I believe Iran has not stood down. I think it's simply a question of when and where and how Iran retaliates to this. I think the real turning point, what's one other point on Amos? I think it's a mistake to call Soleimani a terrorist. Let me explain by that what I mean. Yes, he did terrorist things, but he was an official of the country of Iran. He was not working for some independent organization like bin Laden or al-Baghdadi. Iran is using terrorist tactics as a form of warfare. So to see him as simply a terrorist, no, he was probably the second most powerful person in the government of Iran. And as a result, we need to think about how we want to deal with Iran, rather than thinking of him in any way as a terrorist who's better understood as someone who works for a non-state actor. So I actually think there's that's a distinction with the difference between the tactics of it and the status of it. Most important, where did all this come from? I would say Soleimani's death, as welcome as it was not the turning point. The turning point was the US decision unilaterally to get out of the 2015 Joint Plan of Action. We then put in place economic sanctions that were draconian and effective, which was a form of economic warfare. Iran then responded the only way it could. It could not respond symmetrically with economic warfare of its own, so it responded using warfare, using the tactics of terrorism, if you will. So that is where we stand now, and after Soleimani and after the Iranian attacks on Iraq, we increased the sanctions. So the real question is, what is our definition of success here? What is the end game? So now, see, Martin, I've gotten to your question. And I believe the administration is still wedded to regime change, to basically either bringing down this regime or coercing it into so fundamentally changing its behavior on nuclear issues, missile issues, and on regional extension of its influence that it would be unrecognizable. I do not believe that will succeed. I believe this regime is resilient and brutal. It will be brutal towards its own people if need be, as the economic costs go up. So I actually think we have, to use an American expression, teed things up very well. And the real question is, are we prepared to offer up a deal to the Iranians that I believe they would have trouble rejecting? And I think would be a deal under which we would reduce some of the economic pressure in exchange for much longer-term draconian nuclear limits and missile limits. We can't expect, I think, a deal to manage Iran's regional behavior. I think we have to do things in places like Syria, just like Israel has been doing things in places like Syria. And I think we should make it public. I believe we ought to put the Iranian regime on the defensive to force them to explain to their own people why they continue to do what they're doing on nuclear issues, missile issues, and regional issues, and turn down the chance reject the chance to improve the standard of living for every Iranian. So let's put a reasonable deal on the table, and let's force the Iranian regime to either accept it, and I think the sanctions may have brought us to that point, or to risk greater domestic instability if they turn it down.
Amos, we're out of time, but since you're the director
1
of
minute.
the Institute...
1 minute. Qasem Soleimani maybe was not a terrorist. I think he was a terrorist. But he operated a network of terrorists in the Middle East. And the fact that your embassy in Beirut was blown up with 283 Marines is an Iranian attack on the US that you prefer to be in denial. But you can't be in denial when your UAV, Global Hawk, 200 million, not a small drone, 200 million Boeing-size reconnaissance airplane over international water was shut down by Iran that took responsibility. And you don't call it a declaration of war. So I think in this Middle East, when something like this happens, if you are not reacting, you are encouraging more terror, more attack on Americans, more killing of Americans. And I think there is a time to make a stop to that. And get rid of Soleimani, in my view, was the right decision. I regret you haven't done it before.
Again, I believe we ought to have responded to the drone. We ought to have responded to the attack on Saudi Arabia. I think it was a big mistake not to have done that. And again, I actually think we ought to be having a debate in the American Congress, this is a funny place to make this argument, about whether we need an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force against Iran. Right now, we have them against terrorists and against Iraq. The one against Iraq should be taken off the books. That's silly at this point. But we ought to have a serious debate, because Iran should not be able to use the tactics of terrorism and get away with it. So that, to me, is a legitimate, that's a legitimate debate that we need to have.
So we are in agreement on that.
John is insisting on
just,
having a word.
well, just 1 second. Look, one of the reasons that, and Amos said Americans seem to be ambivalent over the death of Qasem Soleimani. I don't know that they were ambivalent at all. I think the issue was we had no context. The president created no context within which the killing of Qasem Soleimani had a strategic value to us as a plan. He was in our crosshairs many times. His OPSEC was terrible. We could have been killing him for years. The question was, in each time, whether he was more valuable to the region strategically alive for the purposes of stability or tactically dead. And that was a hard decision all the time. But he was someone who was covered and drenched in blood. But the United States has not given the American people, and probably more widely our allies and our competitors and some of the aggressive elements in the region, we've not given them the context within which we killed this guy. And when we say he was going to blow up the American embassy, and then we decided there's 4 more embassies, that's not context. This goes to deterrence theory. Deterrence theory is not precise. You never really know whether you deter someone or not. But if you're going to, you have to have an unambiguous capability that is credible and is clear. The United States has not been clear about what will happen to Iran if it does certain things. So creating the strategic context within which we vaporized this guy and another really bad guy in Iraq, and put it in the larger context of the deterrence that the United States will mete out in the region, is the way that we protect our interests, the interests of Israel, and the interests of our allies around the world. But we've got to be unambiguous about this and not be fabricating it as we're moving along.
And on that note, I'd ask you to thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion.